All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch of Who Tells the Story of Dieppe, a new digital exhibition and educational resource. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Alex Fitzgerald Black, and I am the Executive Director at the Juno Beach Centre Association, the Ontario-based charity that owns and operates the Juno Beach Centre, Canada's Second World War Museum and Cultural Centre on the D-Day landing beaches in Normandy, France. Just a few quick tips for attendees using Zoom. Your cameras are automatically turned off and your microphones are muted, so you won't be able to adjust any of these settings, but you can, however, access the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to send along any questions you have through that Q&A function during the webinar. I will do my best to respond to you during the webinar or to get us to address them in the Q&A session that will follow the panel discussion near the end of the webinar. We are also recording this webinar and we'll be posting it on our YouTube channel and website for other viewers. One of the components of Who Tells the Story of Dieppe that we are excited to bring Canadians is Indigenous Service. So in that same spirit, we are grateful for our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit veterans. The Juno Beach Centre Association office is located in Burlington, Ontario, and Burlington as we know it today is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Haudenosaunee and the Métis, the lands spanning from Lake Ontario to the Niagara Escarpment are steeped in Indigenous history. The territory is mutually covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and other allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We would like to acknowledge that the land on which our office resides is part of the treaty lands and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So I'd like to begin today by thanking everyone for being here, including some very special guests I will introduce in a moment. Now, today marks the 80th anniversary of the Dieppe Raid, Canada's darkest day of the Second World War. On that day, soldiers from across Canada, and in particular Ontario, suffered heavy casualties, with those losses being felt across the province in the weeks, years, and decades that followed. Thanks to a Resilient Communities Fund grant of $119,500 from the Ontario Trillium Foundation, the Juno Beach Centre Association was able to both address our fundraising and education strategies in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, today is an opportunity to showcase the educational resource this funding supported. But before we get started, given that it is an important anniversary today, I ask that we share a brief moment of silence to remember the soldiers, sailors, and airmen who lost their lives in Operation Jubilee. Thank you, everyone. I would now like to introduce and welcome Natalie Pierre, Member of Provincial Parliament for Burlington, Ontario, to say a few words. Mrs. Pierre is the Parliamentary Assistant to the Minister of Colleges and Universities and is a member of the Standing Committee on Social Policy. Please go ahead, Natalie.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Alex, for inviting me to participate in the webinar today. And I'd also like to say thank you to Louisa Simmons, the Programs and Outreach Coordinator for the Juno Beach Centre Association, for inviting me to today's event, and would like to recognize Bill Laidlaw from the Ontario Trillium Foundation and Ian Duncan from Garth Webb Secondary School. It's a pleasure to be here today. And on behalf of the Government of Ontario, I'd like to recognize the Juno Beach Centre Association for the role they play in commemorating Canadians who served during the Second World War. On this day, the 80th anniversary of Dieppe, we remember the sacrifices and the hardships of Canadian soldiers. The Juno Beach Centre is a permanent memorial to all Canadians who served during the Second World War and serves to remember and commemorate Canadians, to educate adults, children, and future generations about the role Canada played on the world stage. I'm pleased that the Juno Beach Centre Association has received a grant through the Resilient Communities Fund from the Ontario Trillium Foundation to help expand educational programming, to help with fundraising initiatives and with staffing. Our government recognizes the importance of organizations like the Juno Beach Centre Association, and through the Ontario Trillium Foundation, organizations can continue to share in our provinces and countries' rich history and culture. As the member of Provincial Parliament for Burlington, I want to thank those who fought for freedom and for justice during the Second World War. It's because of them that we enjoy the freedom and democracy we do today. Let us never forget their courage and commitment to making the world a safer place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us today, Mrs. Pierre, and thank you for those kind words. We appreciate the support of the Ontario government, and we have to note as well, not just the recent support, but also that the government of Ontario gave $1 million to help the Juno Beach Centre become reality back in 2003. Without that sort of contribution, we may not have had that museum on Juno Beach today, and so we really do appreciate you being here today. I'd like to also welcome Bill Laidlaw, representative of the Ontario Trillium Foundation, to say a few words.
Thanks very much. Again, my name is Bill Laidlaw. Was a teacher many years ago, taught history, did my research at Queen's University, studying the Royal Canadian Air Force in the Second World War, so I'm very familiar with the great work you do. I'm a member of the OTF's grant review team in Halton Peel and a resident of Burlington. And I'm pleased to be here with our new MPP, Natalie Pierre, to celebrate the Centre's $134,400 Resilient Communities Fund grant. Just a little bit about this. As an agency of the Government of Ontario, one of the leading granting foundations in Canada, OTF invested nearly $209 million in over 2,000 non-for-profit led community projects last year. Our mission is simple: to build healthier, more vibrant communities across Ontario. Something that binds and strengthens communities in our shared community, as OTF grant has allowed the Juno Beach Centre to weather the COVID pandemic and to launch a brand new digital educational resource about a crucial chapter in Canada's military history, the Dieppe Raid of 1942. JBC's crucial educational work, powered by OTF's grant, will allow them to reach thousands of Ontarians and educate them with quality virtual learning. Before I wrap up, I want to thank the Juno Beach Foundation for giving us the opportunity to contribute to their crucial educational work to ensure we never forget the sacrifices of our brave servicemen and women made 80 years ago. Congratulations once again. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Laidlaw, for being with us here today and for the Ontario Trillium Foundation's contribution to the Juno Beach Centre Association. I too am really keen on the story of the Royal Canadian Air Force in the Second World War, and we actually will have a story to share about that in this resource, which is very exciting.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Of course, I haven't kept up with my slides. My apologies, everyone. So now we're going to move into a resource tour, and I'm going to hand things over to Louisa, who's going to dictate this.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, we'll do a whirlwind tour kind of the resource here, and then go into more depth about the work in our panel discussion coming up. So the best way to access Who Tells the Story of Dieppe is to simply go to our website, junobeach.org, and you'll see the Learn tab at the top, and just go down to Who Tells the Story of Dieppe. This will bring you directly to the resource, and we should mention this is a fully bilingual resource, so should you prefer to view it in French, just up in the right-hand corner, you can click that French button. So when you come onto the resource page, you automatically see the first of 4 sections that make up Who Tells the Story of Dieppe. This first section provides you with some contextual background about the raid itself, some of the facts that students and anybody accessing this resource will need in order to kind of build upon their understanding of different narratives that the other sections explore. You'll see at the bottom of the page here a lesson plan that educators can download. This is one of 4 lesson plans that educator Ian Duncan, who's with us today, has developed for this resource that builds upon the materials on the webpage, as well as additional materials that he's compiled in classroom activities, etc. So when you continue scrolling down to the bottom of the page, you'll see the other 3 sections that make up the bulk of this resource, looking at different narratives about the raid and how they change based on who's telling the story. So the first one here, military propaganda. you look at it and scroll through, you'll start to see just how many different types of materials we've included in this resource. Posters, cartoons, videos, etc. And in this section, the two kind of stars are really this video you see here, an Allied propaganda video about Dieppe, as well as a German propaganda video further down on the page. And I promise if your students watch both of these, they will have very different things to say about how the raid is represented in each, which is really the point of this section of the resource. Continue scrolling down, you see other pieces of propaganda, including those that people of Dieppe were subjected to as an occupied area. And at the bottom of the page, another lesson plan with many other examples of propaganda about Dieppe and activities and classroom learning for students. Continuing on down, we get to the next section, which is called In Their Own Voices. If I was forced to choose a favorite section, I think it would definitely be this, because here we share the experiences of 5 different individuals who were impacted by the raid. Diversity of experience was really, really important to us when developing this resource. So we feature an Indigenous veteran, a Black Canadian soldier, a mother, a medic, and a Dieppe civilian here. And I'll highlight Junius Hoken, who you see on the screen right now, one of very few Black Canadians to become a pilot during the Second World War, particularly because at his time of enlistment in 1940, the RCAF still had some very discriminatory practices, which you can actually see on his service file we've embedded here. It says he's a fine type of lad, if no objection to ancestry. So we thought that including this source was really important for students to be able to kind of see the tangible evidence of Hoken's experience. That's also evident in Mary McLean's story. She was a mother whose son, Robert, died in the raid. And for months and months, Mary would not believe that her son, who she believes is pictured in this image, was dead. And she writes many, many letters to the Canadian government, 2 of which we include in the resource, scrolling down a little bit more, with transcriptions, so they're easier to read, but so that people looking at this resource can have a kind of emotional connection to Mary's experience. Those are just 2 of the stories featured on this page, but like the others, there's an associated lesson plan with many more testimonies that Ian has compiled that gives students the opportunity to connect with whomever they feel most represents the story of Dieppe to them. And finally, our last section, when you scroll down to the menu, is modern memory. When we're thinking about narratives, of course, the narrative we tell about Dieppe today is still important as well through this lens of commemoration. So that's what this section does. It looks at what Dieppe means to people in the present and features kind of 2 videos as the main sections. The first, called The Lasting Legacy of Dieppe, that traces the impact of this one-day event through the decades up to the present, and also features both Alex and Marie-Ève, who are with us today. And then the other main section of this section, rather, is a video called They Walk With You. This video is really very special because this is the first time it has ever been made available outside of the museum in France. Usually you have to be in the museum itself to see it. And because of some licensing restrictions, the way to view this video will be that an educator submits their email and they receive a password that they can then give to their students. We will never do anything with your emails, and your students don't need to provide any personal information at all. But we wanted to include this video because it really creates a wonderful connection between like the emotional response of contemporary Canadians and our responsibility to remember and commemorate those who gave their lives for us. Then the resource ends on these really interesting sliding images of Dieppe just after the raid and today, which feels like a very poignant way to kind of cap off this resource that looks at how narratives change over time. So that's a very quick run through, but we're going to talk about it in much more detail now in a panel discussion featuring myself, Marie-Ève, and Ian.
All right. Let me just get myself organized here. Scrolling down. There we are. So now to introduce our panel. I'm so very grateful that we've been able to assemble this panel of educators, historians, and curators who worked very hard to make Who Tells the Story of Dieppe a reality. So I'll make some very quick introductions and then we'll roll right into some questions. If the panelists would like to unmute themselves to prepare, that would be excellent. So we have Ian Duncan, who is a history educator with Garth Webb Secondary School. He wrote the lesson plans, as Louisa was discussing earlier, for this resource. And for those of you who may not know, Garth Webb Secondary School is located in Oakville, Ontario, and it is named after the visionary and founder of the Juno Beach Centre, Garth Webb, a Second World War veteran who landed on Juno Beach on D-Day. We also have Marie-Ève Vaillancourt, who is our Director of Exhibitions with the Juno Beach Centre Association. She was the project manager and made sure that we got our From Dieppe to Juno new temporary exhibition done, and it opened in March of this year and runs until the end of 2023 at the Juno Beach Centre in France. And then finally, you've already been introduced to Louisa Simmons. She is our Programs and Outreach Coordinator at the Juno Beach Centre Association, and she was the project manager for the Who Tells the Story of Dieppe project. And so we really appreciate her work on this effort. So my first question is for Louisa, and the question is, why did we choose the Dieppe Raid as a topic for this educational resource?
Yeah, the reality is there are a lot of reasons that we chose the raid. The most obvious one probably is that today is the 80th anniversary of the Dieppe Raid. And anniversaries really provide an opportunity for us to reintroduce and revisit historical events with kind of fresh eyes and connect them to the present. Because of course, as these events get further and further into the past, we lose kind of living connections to them. So anniversaries present this opportunity to talk about them again and ensure that we're kind of remembering and re-engaging with them. Because of course, the Dieppe Raid does hold a really particular place in Canadian social memory. For decades and decades, it was the event that defined Canada's involvement in the Second World War. Today, we think more probably about Juno Beach and Canada's participation on D-Day. And the two are really interesting because, of course, D-Day is a victory, whereas the Dieppe Raid is seen as a failure and a large loss of life. But just because it is a failure doesn't mean that it doesn't have a place in our social memory and that we have a responsibility to remember just as much as the victories. And then kind of the final piece is that when we were thinking about developing this resource, we wanted to make sure it was actually useful to teachers in the classroom. So we enlisted the help of a volunteer editorial board of retired and current educators to look at curriculums in Ontario and across Canada to actually look at where the Dieppe Raid might fit in. And what we found is that there isn't really currently many places for it. It doesn't usually exist as kind of a standalone topic that educators have the time to talk about. So I'll speak about this a bit later, but what we did was format this resource in a way in which it fits some of the broader themes in curricula and really allows educators to still bring it in and still talk about the Dieppe Raid in a meaningful way that fits within the larger requirements of the curricula.
Thank you, Louisa. My next question is for Marie-Ève. Marie-Ève's joining us. She's been very busy today on CBC News for the official commemorations and helping to provide some analysis. But Marie-Ève, this resource asks people to consider many different narratives that proliferate about the raid. Why is Dieppe so contentious?
Yes, it's a question that's on everybody's mind. And of course, when you experience losses from 60 to 90%, it's enormous. And normally, just to compare, a military operation expects that there will be around 10% losses. So from there, it becomes really difficult to justify the losses in light of the fact that hardly any of the objectives were met. And so for what remains the question that so many historians ask. Various explanations are offered and often debated amongst historians. One of which is, why was the raid allowed to even go forward? What purpose did the raid serve? And why was such a flawed plan allowed to go forward to begin with? And these, to me, I mean, we can go for hours trying to answer these questions, but they never attenuate the fact that the brutal losses were incurred. And even beyond trying to answer these questions, and how hotly debated they are, essentially what we end up with is something that doesn't heal really well in our history. Victories heal well, you know, you have a sense of the peace that was brought forward and the change that could happen because of it. But with Dieppe, it's contentious, and it remains to be so to that day. All of this, I should say, what's most important to me is that we judge the Dieppe Raid with the benefit of hindsight. And that's something that we need to reconsider. Our position today is that of observers and that of having the ability to think critically and analytically with all the evidence that we've built up. But at the time, the raid seemed like a logical and sensible thing to do. And from there, the student's perspective is to really, you know, look at why was it that it made sense at the time and why doesn't it make any sense to us today. So that's one way to look at it, especially with this educational resource and what Ian Duncan was able to do.
Well, thank you for that answer and for that segue to Ian, because he's my next question. Ian, what was the development process for the lesson plans that accompany each section of the resource?
Thanks, Alex. Good afternoon, everyone. I really wanted students to engage with Dieppe because as much as we're talking about this being part of sort of a social memory, my students and many of their families, unless they are professional or amateur historians who, you know, are weaned on this as I was as a young person, they don't come to my classroom with that knowledge. And so we're asking them to remember things they haven't learned. So often I find I'm the first line of introduction around much of our history, but certainly our the history of our service as a nation. So that is really where I wanted to sort of start the whole piece on how do we introduce it in a way that's current and relevant to young learners. You know, we took this idea and we wanted it to be an individualized perspective on students. And that's really where I start with is, you know, like what would the student get out of it? And in fact, I worked with a small focus group of my own students on the inquiry questions. So to, you know, call out some of my own students with gratitude because they were the ones who inspired the questions around the work. Because I said, if I'm developing something for many students potentially across the country, I also wanted to make sure that the process included some of my students. We don't spend a lot of time with Dieppe in my classroom because we have a very crowded curriculum. So it's really nice to be able to like take the time out and really focus in on that. I wanted my students to engage in a real critical analysis of not just this historical narrative, but all narratives. So that's something my students are really accustomed to in my classroom because it's not just this event we sort of dig into, it's all kinds of events that we dig into in a very similar manner. As a result, you know, in this case, yes, I constructed some of that, but I really wanted lessons to be something that students and teachers could co-construct together because I found as a teacher, when I was exposed to the resources and the exhibit sources and everything, you know, Louisa helped to provide and Maria as well through what was created in the digital exhibit as well as sort of the physical exhibit overseas. That really inspired me. I didn't know, you know, I think it's really important to also acknowledge as a teacher, as someone who has taught World War II history for 20 years, I didn't know the depth that existed about Dieppe until doing this work. And so why I say we need a process that teachers and students can work together to co-construct learning is really important. So that was a really big part of that process as well, trying to build out things that allow for inquiry for teachers to learn alongside their students, rather than expecting our educators to be sort of the fonts of all knowledge on a topic. The sources, like I mentioned, were very inspirational, and it's sort of my encouragement that part of any educator applying the lessons or resources to their classroom is take the time to explore them, because you will be inspired in your own lessons and your own activities and your own ideas from the resources.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that great answer. Mary-Eve, I think we're back to you next. This resource uses materials that are included in the Juno Beach Center's current temporary exhibition From Dieppe to Juno. What considerations did you have to make when you were selecting which stories to tell about the Dieppe Raid in that exhibition?
Well, Louisa has already pointed at that by bringing out the diversity of voices in the education program, and that is really a reflection of the exhibition. So early on in the research phase for the exhibition, which lasted about a year, we all quickly became overwhelmed with emotions and the human trauma that was experienced. So on one hand, you could really look at the raid from a logical, analytical perspective of those who planned it, those who organized it. And then you could also look at it from the perspective of a mother who didn't know whether her son was killed or alive, whether her husband was missing in action or killed in action. Those kinds of things where you're just constantly reminded that, yes, you can offer explanations and you can remain really logical about things, but then the legacies, the emotional legacies are there. So we went about doing an exhibition that would combine both these aspects and constantly take people from the perspective of understanding the raid and then also understanding the ripple effect, the consequences. And so trying to provide a 360-degree view on the Dieppe raid was really important. So the French civilian perspective and the German soldiers' perspective was really important to that effect, yes.
Yes, thank you, Mary Evan. I can remember myself going through some of that research with you, and just, you had to make some hard decisions as to what stories we could tell. It's only so much space in that exhibition room. But the nice thing is, with this virtual exhibit, we were able to add in a couple of new stories that aren't even featured in the exhibition too. So you got a mix of stories that are in the physical exhibition and a mix of stories that we were able to provide here online. Louisa, what was the reasoning behind dividing the resource into the 4 main categories that we reviewed with the tour?
Yeah, so when we were kind of thinking about how to fit this resource in a meaningful way into curricula so that teachers and educators could actually use it, we had to think about kind of things like historical inquiry skills and these basic concepts that exist in a bunch of curricula across the country. And so by dividing our kind of resource into these 4 categories, a kind of intro section, and then 3 different types of narratives, we create this kind of chronological and interpretive structure. So if you see the diagram on the right, you see those 4 categories, and they loosely follow a timeline. You have the Dieppe Raid itself on August 19th, the military propaganda, which is the main narrative about the raid directly afterwards. And then when you move to In Their Own Voices, you start to hear experiences of people in the years and decades after as they start to process what impact this event left on them, whether they were actively participating or connected in some other way. And then you get up to modern memory. Of course, like, we are an institution that deals in commemorative narratives, and it's really important to acknowledge that and how important it is, but also give students a chance to think about that and what that means in the way that we talk about historical narrative today. And it just leans into exactly what Mary was just talking about in our exhibition as well, that concept of a plurality of voices, making sure that there is something there for everyone and that there's enough diverse perspectives that we aren't the dominant voice. We didn't want the Juno Beach Center's interpretive text to be the dominant voice in this resource. We wanted the materials to speak for themselves, so that students can use the inquiry skills they are working so hard to develop. And it really just this format allows students to think about the resource module question as well that Ian developed, which he'll talk about right now.
Well, and before we get there, I just wanted to make a note about, especially the modern memory piece that you were talking about, Louisa. If you were able to watch it this morning, there was the ceremony in France. Veterans Affairs Canada helped organize that. And, the French government was involved, the rest of the Canadian government as well. Like, that's a primary source potentially for educators to use to view, what did we just experience in terms of how we commemorated that event. And there were some really interesting things that were said. I remember, and I don't want to belabor this too much, but there was one, I think it was a French official who was talking about the various different, reasons put out for the raid and trying to kind of come to grips with that. And then also the war in Ukraine was mentioned in the context of, that ceremony. And so there's questions about, why and how are we commemorating the raid? What do these events tell us or relate to what's going on in our world today? So I should probably get to the question for Ian. Ian, the lesson plan's module question, the overarching question is, does Canada's journey from Dieppe to D-Day matter to you? What do you hope that the students will take away from this overarching inquiry question?
I really try to create a question that would allow my students and students across the country exploring the resource and the exhibit to decide for themselves what they think about this history. I think, you know, we've all acknowledged, and you're acknowledging it still, Alex and Louisa and Marielle as well, like this is something that we know historically there has been a given narrative, and we're questioning who created that narrative and what was excluded from it. I'd rather the students make their own minds up about it, especially because a lot of them will say, well, why am I learning this in the first place? You're telling me it's important, but I might say that it's not important to me. And where I am as a 15, 16, 12-year-old, depending on, you know, where your curriculum in what province, you know, you might explore this content. And so it's really important that students are thinking for themselves about Dieppe, but about all history. And more than anything, my students asked me to create something that respected their perspectives and their impressions of the history. And so when we ask a question, does this matter to you? It does sort of focus the learning back on the individual student, because there are lots of our students who, despite the incredible diversity of voice found in the resources and in the lesson plans, still don't see themselves in that. And so it's about them, and their perspective is worthy and worthwhile, particularly if it's one that's the result of study and exploration. And so that's really something I wanted the question to inspire from the get-go, is I don't want you to tell me what I think about Dieppe, because as I mentioned earlier, I'm sort of that weaned on this history as a young Canadian person in my own life, but they haven't been in the same way, and it's been a long time. So really to create an enduring impact of learning about the Dieppe Raid, I wanted it to be personal. And I find that when the learning becomes personal to students, when they make those connections to voices and stories, when they explore resources and get mad, you know, if I can get my students to get angry about Dieppe, even as like, why is this happening? And why are we doing this? And what about this anniversaryism? And why are we commemorating this? And then they will have a personal connection to it. And that learning about Dieppe will endure regardless of their individual identities and all the facets of those identities. So it was really my hope that they would just be allowed to make their own decision about history, and they can use the history to support that decision whichever way. And so it doesn't say you need to tell me what my decision about Dieppe is or what the JBC's decision about Dieppe is. Instead, I would rather hear what their decision is. I think that's where we can engage young minds across the country in this sort of commemorative learning, but also in learning that allows it to be, you know, very present, you know, in their lives, and hopefully remain that way. Again, I mentioned earlier, when we have Remembrance Day, my students say, well, what am I remembering? So as a history educator, it's one of my core jobs is to try to give them materials that hopefully they will remember, not just this year, but every year after.
I think that's a really great answer. And one of the things that kind of stands out to me is we have to also understand there's different narratives about Dieppe, and not everybody agrees. The historians don't agree. Not even the veterans agree. There was a group of veterans who for years would send a piece of cake to Major General Hamilton Roberts because of his, supposedly he said, oh, this operation is going to be a piece of cake before they did it. And then there's other veterans, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, who won the VC, the Victoria Cross at Dieppe, who said, you know, let's stop giving the generals dirt. You know, we did, you know, this is what happened, but we went willingly, you know, so even the veterans don't necessarily agree on how to interpret the event. So why should we expect our students as well? And so I think that's great. Louisa, over to you. This resource features, as you showed, a video produced by the Juno Beach Center titled The Lasting Legacy of Dieppe. What does the addition of this video among the other assets in there achieve?
Yeah, I think the video is a really good example of what we were trying to do with the resource as a whole. On a very surface level, it's the addition of a multimedia piece. Like I mentioned when we were working through this resource, we tried really hard to have lots of different types of materials that students can engage with and kind of try and keep our interpretive text itself fairly limited. There's some in every section, but trying to keep it a bit limited so the materials speak for themselves. And this video was an attempt to do that as well. We knew that we wanted a video that talked about the Dieppe Raid in the resource, but when I looked at the existing ones, I kind of found that so many of them start when the landing craft approach Dieppe and end when they pull away in retreat, less than 10 hours later. And none of these resources really talked about what happens afterwards. Marie-Ève talks a lot about kind of the ripple effect of the Dieppe Raid, and we really wanted to explore that in this video. This is what happened at the Dieppe Raid, but here's what happened to those Canadian craft who didn't make it back to England at the end of the day. They became prisoners of war. They spent the next 2 years in prisoner of war camps. What happens to those soldiers who returned to Dieppe in 1944, coming back and liberating a city that such a tragedy happened at 2 years prior? And then what do we think about the raid today? So it's this video that encapsulates the concept of a ripple effect, and that there is a lasting legacy of Dieppe, and that it changes over time and depending on who's telling the story, not to say the same things over again. But it just feels like it's a good example of what we are trying to do with this resource as a whole. Here's the Dieppe Raid, but it's not just about this singular event. We're trying to dive in, kind of break it apart, and let those who are looking at this resource form opinions for themselves based on the materials that exist within it.
Yes, thank you, Louisa, and thanks for your work on that video. I know you worked very hard to bring it to life. Ian, how can educators use the resource and lesson plans in their own classrooms?
We hope for something that would be flexible enough to work into just about any history teacher's classroom and at multiple different grade levels, because curriculum across the country is different, and you may be studying World War II history in grade 8 in Nova Scotia or in grade 10 in Ontario, for example. So we wanted to make sure that it was sort of classroom ready for a number of different grade levels, that teachers could be inspired and work with it even at a grade 12 level in a grade 12 Canadian history course or otherwise. So that was the first consideration. And the second is that teachers don't all teach these courses in chronology. They may not have a World War II unit. And so they may decide to just do a special anniversary sort of 1 week or less focus on the Dieppe Raid and do a number of the activities. I tried to create lesson plans where teachers would even shop. I like this activity. I've already established what propaganda is, so I don't need to do this activity. I definitely want to pull out this piece, but I don't want to do that one. So that there is a pick and choose function to the way in which students access the 4 sort of components of the website resourcing. And then additionally, that teachers may not choose to do all 4 of the lessons. They might choose to just do lesson number 1, because that's something that they feel they have time for in their exploration of World War II. Because as Louisa mentioned before, it sort of levels its way out as a chronology or as a bit of a timeline. I think it's also nice to be able to say, oh, I have a thematic module on service in Canada. That's great for for the first component of the website. Well, I have a really great module inquiry on commemoration. Well, why not look at modern memory in that case, or in diversity and diverse experiences throughout the country's history? Maybe you have a great thematic module there too, and you might pull lesson 3 into the mix. So it's hopefully something that allows for the ultimate flexibility, regardless of an educator's calendar or classroom or planning. That you may not find that you have an entire week to spend on this singular topic, or you might decide that yes, this time, because it's the 80th anniversary today, and we sort of are looking at that season of remembrance, that's a great way to really bring that to life right now for students.
Absolutely, yeah. Marie-Ève, last question to you. Why is the Dieppe Raid still relevant today?
This was the question that was also asked of me this morning when I was on CBC, and to go back to your comments about what was said during that ceremony, I think it was really clear that the planners of that ceremony were after showcasing youth and including youth and having youth involved and speak. And so I think going back to what Ian was saying, students ask us really tough questions, such as, why should I remember this? And it's up to us to find some really poignant and relevant answers for them, and that's the transmission of memory happening right there. For sure, it's we have our own responses to this, you know, like when I'm asked why it's important for me, it's about honoring and respecting human suffering and having an ability to build empathy towards others. And so as such, when you study Dieppe, you're building not only future historians, hopefully, but future citizens. And the action of analyzing the past is a citizen action. The action of studying and wanting to become a historian is through analytical thinking and those kinds of teachings that Ian has developed. So Dieppe offers a really great segue into all of these aspects, you know, and I think that the key aspect right now is so focused on youth. And our tradition ceremonies are changing and are reflecting that change so well. And I'm glad that youth can have such, be featured so prominently in speeches and being included in that. So I think that's my answer. In light of what has happened today so far in my day, you know, I see the media interviews are often asking me that question. Why is it relevant? Are the young people aware of this? You know, like there's a real moment in time right now where we transition away from our second war veterans into the future generations, and there's a moment of fragility. So education becomes even more important. Yeah.
No, that's very well put, Mary Ev. And I think the one thing I might add to the conversation is, I think as a democracy, it's really important that we have these conversations and we do embark on remembrance education. And a big part of that is because as citizens, as people who are going to be raised, you know, young students who are going to be raised to hopefully vote and participate in our society, they may need to make decisions in the future about whether this country should go to war. And the reality is sometimes when you go to war, mistakes are made and something like the Dieppe Raid may happen. And so that's a potential, you know, cost that you have to consider when you make those sorts of decisions. On the other hand, the Canadian military played a significant role in winning the Second World War at the end of the day, and, you know, liberating Dieppe, as we've talked about, in 1944. And that was really important. And so there are, you know, positives and negatives, you know, to going to war, and you have to consider all of those things. And you have to be careful not to, you know, simply label Dieppe as a suicide mission, you know, and you also have to be careful not to glorify war as well in making those judgments. That's all the time we have for the panel today. Thank you both, or all three of you, Ian, Mary Ev, and Louisa, very much for your answers and for joining us today. Now it's time to throw open the floor to any questions from our audience, whether they be some of our panelists or any of the attendees in the audience. And we have a very small group of attendees today, so I'm happy to actually, if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can ask the question live on air. Or if you prefer, you can simply enter something in the Q&A. Wayne Axford has a question. I will unmute you now, Wayne. Hi there, Wayne.
Yes, thank you, Alex. I'm from British Columbia, and I was on the advisory panel, and so pleased to see what you've been able to do with this, and very much appreciate the work of the Juno Beach Center to do this. Unfortunately, there is a small number of us today, and suspect of that being summer holidays. The presentation, well, Louisa, that you did earlier would, I think, work very well into a workshop, and many teacher associations, socialized teachers associations across the country are having conferences in the fall. I would hope that we'll be able to make some contact with you and hopefully have arrangements to do some like a workshop this that you've done today with teachers in the fall. I think it's an excellent program. And Ian, congratulations to you too on developing some very thoughtful resources, and to the Juno Beach Center for always making your resources available. And particularly, I was so pleased to hear that They Walk With You is now going to be available for the people who can't get to the Juno Beach Center to see it.
Well, thank you for those comments, Wayne. And yes, I think we're going to try to dedicate some of Louisa's time this fall and perhaps into the new year to get this resource out there. And maybe if you want to join, Ian, if you have time, maybe you can join forces with Louisa and make that effort happen. Any other questions? I thought I saw another hand up, but then it disappeared. Got one in the chat here. Having not had a chance to go through this resources from Robin Baker, but looking forward to going through it, does any of this touch on the research of David O'Keefe? Louisa, I think the answer to that is no. I don't think in the resource we touch on that. However, Robin, in the full exhibit over in France at the Juno Beach Center, we do address this. We actually had an Enigma machine on display for the first few months of the exhibit, and I think we might be looking to get a replacement. We'll see. But we did very much, we have a whole panel on the intelligence war and the war at sea. And so we do address that. I think we take the general position that we want people to kind of decide for themselves how relevant that is to the overall narrative that they would like to kind of construct about the Dieppe Raid. But I think my comment is that the historical evidence suggests that David O'Keefe is absolutely correct, that there was an objective. The reality, unfortunately, was the objective was not reached. And I think David does a good job arguing that it was the primary purpose of the raid, but I don't think I don't think everybody out there is quite convinced 100% on that yet. And so it still remains open for debate. And that is the way we left it in the exhibition over in France. Had a lovely comment too. Robin says to totally understand. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for being here today, Robin. Really appreciate your question. Any other questions? All right, if I don't see any hands and I don't see anybody writing, I think we'll start to wrap things up here. Let me move to my next slide. I was supposed to have that up for the Q&A. Well done, Alex. Once again, thank you to everybody who participated and attended this webinar today. We encourage you to explore Who Tells the Story of Dieppe on our website and to send us your feedback. You can send it to jvca@junobeach.org or just find any of our emails, maybe Louisa's email on our website. As noted earlier, this webinar was recorded and the recording should be available in the next few days. We'll be posting it on our YouTube page. We'll also be sending out a newsletter with the link in it. I want to say to the teachers out there, best of luck in the coming fall term. I know you have a lot of work ahead of you, and school is, sounds like it's going to be 100% back in person again. So best of luck and stay healthy. And to everybody, thank you so much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.